Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all being here. Thank you for inviting me to be your patron. Thank you for finding me a pin when I couldn't find mine when I arrived here. How very embarrassing. I took it out of my makeup bag because I carry it everywhere in Britain so I can wear it and brag. And I've recently been abroad and I didn't want to lose it where I couldn't easily go and get it back. So I left it behind. It's on my bathroom window ledge. Basically, I'm going to show you my holiday photographs. So just settle back. Why are we here today? Well, what's really lovely is that usually I'm talking to people who I'm trying to persuade of a view that dying might be something that we could do better with, that we could be better at thinking about, that we could be better at acknowledging. Whereas today I feel like I'm talking to my tribe, and that's really, really lovely. So I'm standing here with 40 years experience of death and dying, but also 40 years experience of talking to people who didn't know how to talk about it. And to start off with, I was one of those people, because we recruit our doctors and our nurses and our healthcare professionals out of a society that doesn't talk about dying. So one day in late 2015, when I was working in a big teaching hospital in the northeast of England, we got a call at our palliative care team office to come across urgently to the emergency room and to come to resus. Now, you don't often invite the palliative care team into resus, but in the resuscitation room was a man in his late 90s with his family around him, and the paramedics had just discontinued CPR as they delivered him into the hospital because they'd managed to restore some kind of electrical rhythm, but his heart basically was doing nothing. And his medical history was up on the screen, and to cut a very long story short, his liver still worked fine. But everything else had been not right, and he had, a bucket of tablets for breakfast, lunch, and his evening meal. And you've all met, and you all got family members who live like that. So this man had been ill with many different things wrong with him for many years, and I said to his sons and his wife who were gathered around him, what did your dad and your husband say he would want to happen if he was ever so sick that he might be dying? And they kind of blinked at me and said, well, we never really talked about it. Really? So then one of them said, actually, Dad did try to talk to me about it. And I said, Dad, don't be so maudlin. You're fine, man. Because he's from the northeast of England. And he started to cry, and at that point his brother decided that he should try and make him feel better. So there's a thing about northeastern Anglo-Saxon males trying to make emotional contact with each other. So he kind of sidled up to stand alongside his brother, and then without actually making eye contact with him, he started patting his arm. And he said, it wasn't just you, Rob, because my dad asked me if I'd do one of them attorney documents so that Mam wouldn't have to make all the decisions. And I said, Dad, you're going to live forever. And we found a place in the hospital for the dying to continue and for them to accompany him during his dying and to narrate the dying as it unfolded for them so that they understood the pattern. But I carried that family around with me for a long, long time because that wasn't the first or the third or the 10th time I'd had that conversation amongst a family with very elderly relatives who are going to die soon just because they're too old to keep living, even if they haven't got multiple comorbidities. And a family that just cannot bear to have the conversation. And I thought, we can't keep just doing this one family at a time. This is a public health issue. Somebody has to do something about the public understanding of dying. We need better plots in soap operas, and we need something in the Archers, and we need a good documentary on BBC Two, and we need magazine articles, and somebody should write a book, and we just, somebody needs to do something about the public understanding of dying. Somebody should really, really do something about the, oh God. Really? So in early 2016, I handed in my notice, and in the summer of 2016, I stopped doing clinical work to make the space to do something. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew that I needed to make the space for anything to happen. And the week that I was leaving, I was on a ward seeing a patient when I got a phone call from the team secretary, and it's unusual for her to disturb us whilst we're seeing patients. And when I got to the phone, she said, "I thought you would want to take this one. It's BBC Radio 4. They want to talk to you about coming to do an interview in London about dying." I thought, that's all very unexpected. Why would they ask me? Because there are lots of very famous palliative care practitioners in our country, and basically I'm not one of them. But it turned out that they needed an expert on death to talk to somebody who wanted to talk to an expert on death. And they didn't know an expert on death, but the editor's sister is a doctor in the northeast of England, so she phoned her sister and said, "I need an expert on death," and her sister said, "Oh, you need my friend Kath." So on the basis of absolutely no provenance whatsoever, I got flown down to the BBC to do an interview with quite a famous comedian about dying. So I was extremely anxious, and he was extremely hail fellow well met as he guided us through Broadcasting House, introducing us to his friends as we walked through. "Oh, hello, this is Chris Evans." Hello. Until we got into the studio, when he proceeded to have a full-on meltdown about the idea of talking about dying. And as he became very anxious, and as he talked to the crew about how they would have to stop recording if he became more anxious during the recording so that it wasn't on record, I suddenly relaxed into outpatient clinic mode, because this is my territory. So we talked for an hour and 10 minutes. It was a really, really interesting discussion. It was edited down to 14 minutes, which will show you and anybody else who might need to ding-dongs as we go along that 75% of what I say can actually be ignored. But it turned into 14 minutes of fantastic radio, not because I did anything clever, I just described dying, but it was beautifully edited. And it was heard by a literary agent who got in touch and asked if I'd ever thought about writing a book. And since then, some very extraordinary things have happened to the woman whose life I am now living. This photograph is a photograph of a tree just outside Charleston in South Carolina. It's called the Angel Oak. And it was spring when I took its photograph. It had little flowers. You don't think about oak trees having flowers, do you? But obviously if it didn't have flowers, it wouldn't get acorns. It was having somewhere between its 600th and its 2000th spring. It looks as though it's immortal. But of course it's not immortal, it's going to die. And I'm going to die, and you're going to die, and all the people who we love and are fondest of are going to die, apart from the ones who already have died. And just to console you, all the people we don't like very much, they're going to die too. But the difficulty that we've got is that death is something that's dropped out of our sight because all the advances in the second half of the 21st century that enabled untamable death to be delayed and to restore people back to health and vigour in their prime meant that instead of staying at home to die, as my grandmother's parents and brothers and sisters did when they died in the first half of the 20th century, by the second half of the 20th century, they could be taken into hospital and given miraculous new cures like antibiotics or surgery that became technically possible because better anaesthetics were available, or there were new chemotherapy agents coming along. Kidney dialysis became possible, organ transplantation became possible, fantastic advances. But because of that, people sick enough to die stopped being at home, where people were familiar with the sequence of the deathbed. They got taken into hospital, where the objective was to stop people dying And failing to stop people from dying was a failure, but it took place behind closed doors and families just lost track of the sequence of the deathbed. So instead, we now know about normal dying from things like Holby City, EastEnders, Corrie. Here is an average, everyday, happens several times a month, death of a young mum in an intensive care unit, but the baby will get delivered first. Death's got to be really sexy on telly, because otherwise people get up and put the kettle on. And that's how the TV companies know whether people are watching or not. It's by the electricity surges as people get up to put on the telly. Here's another everyday death. I've just come back from New Zealand, where they have problems with orcs. So it's very difficult to find good representations of dying in the media. But people don't know that they're bad representations. They think that, these very, very sensationalized and yet also trivialized deaths are what actually happens. So this is Tom Hanks' character in Philadelphia, and his terminal illness with AIDS is fantastically portrayed. It's really, really good. But you don't see him die. You don't see him die because watching dying, unless you're the person doing it, or unless you really love the person who's doing it, is frankly extremely dull. I feel I'm amongst friends and I can say that. It's not dramatic. It's not going to be compelling because the stuff that's going on, the action, is all in people's minds. It's the reminiscence, and it's the what-ifs, and it's the thinking about, and it's the internal celebration that's going on. It's the stuff of novels, but it's not the stuff of screens. And so we've forgotten what normal dying looks like, and we've substituted it with these kinds of images. So you see a reconciliation between Tom Hanks' character and Denzel Washington's character, and then we shift to a graveyard, and you will notice now that almost always that is how we show that somebody has died, not by showing they're dying, but by shifting to a graveyard. So we've lost that wisdom that once we had, and it is an important loss. So back at the holiday slides, can you see what this is? It's a funeral shop. It's a funeral shop up in the Andes in the north of Ecuador, where our son was teaching for a couple of years. I told you these were my holiday snaps. So for anybody who speaks Spanish, there's a sale on reduced price wooden boxes. It's important that they are competing because there are actually 3 funeral shops on this street. And the other thing that you will notice is that you can have very smart coffin, much more plain coffin, nothing cardboard, nothing paint it yourself. We're not going to pretend that babies don't die. There's no cremation in Ecuador. There's actually no burial in Ecuador either because it's volcanic. So everybody is interred, if you could call it that, above ground, usually in breeze block graves, which are then whitewashed and tended by families and covered in flowers and are picnicked upon at regular intervals so that they don't feel lonely in their breeze block palaces. Death is normalised. Death is what happens. Life expectancy for poor people in Ecuador is still what it was about the middle of the 20th century over here. So everybody understands dying, and as a consequence of that, this kind of thing can happen. I don't know whether you can make out what the shop is next door. It's a cafe. It's a cafe, it's a very popular cafe. It's turning over a brisk trade. The fact that you can buy coffins next door is not interfering with their trade, one jot. Because in Ecuador, everybody dies. Whereas in Britain, clearly everybody doesn't. And in Ecuador, everybody knows that everybody dies, so you don't have to be covert about it. So what I've tried to do in my little book is just really to offer a window back onto dying. So one of the stories is about how I first heard the process of what happens as a human being dies, being described to a very elderly French lady who'd clearly been a woman of enormous courage. She'd been a member of the French resistance during the Second World War. But her fear was that if her bowel cancer, which had now spread to her liver and was killing her, if that started to cause her enormous pain, then she might despair on her deathbed. And being French and Catholic, and from the early part of Catholic traditional wisdom, her belief was that if she despaired on her deathbed, she couldn't go to heaven. She would be in a state of mortal sin and therefore separated forever from her husband, who died about 10 years previously, and she was quite sure that he was in heaven. So although what I thought we were going to talk about was a pain consultation, what we actually went to talk about was existential anxiety, and my boss offering to describe to her the process of normal human dying. And I was absolutely horrified. You're going to do what? Well, will it help you, he said to her, if I describe what you can expect as you die? And I'm sitting on a little stool at the foot of the bed thinking, this is really uncomfortable. And she's saying, oui. And he described that, in the early stages of whatever terminal illness it is, the most usual thing is that people notice just that they're more tired and that they need a lot more sleep to recharge their batteries. And you might be noticing that already, he said to her. And she said, oui. And he said, oh, that's good. Oh, that's good. Oh, that's good, he said, because that means you are following the normal pattern, and what we will expect is that you will be more tired and that you will need more sleep, and as time goes by, you will be asleep more and more, and you will be awake less and less. And something interesting will happen that we will notice, but you probably won't, which is that at some point, a time will come when you look as though you're sleeping very peacefully, but we need to wake you up. Maybe it's medicine time, maybe it's your niece on the phone, and we find we can't wake you up. This happens to everybody, and when they do wake up, they tell us they've had a lovely sleep, but we know they weren't just asleep, that they were actually, for a period of time, unconscious. Do you understand unconscious? Do you want me to say it in French? No, I understand, oui. And I'm thinking, okay, so she'll be tired and she'll be unconscious, and let's go, because this is getting really, really uncomfortable. And the next thing that happens, he said, and I thought, I cannot believe he is still going on with this, is that the periods of being awake almost disappear, and the periods of being asleep become almost constantly unconsciousness, until the person is just unconscious all of the time. And when we're unconscious, the only part of our brain that's really still working is the bit that drives our breathing. It just becomes automatic. It does very particular patterns. It moves between being very deep and slow, and sometimes we don't realise that we're holding our throat tight, so it can make a noise, a kind of noise. But if your niece is here, we will make sure that she knows that this is because you're deeply unconscious, not because you're trying to speak, not because you're feeling distressed. And then the other part of the pattern is shallow breathing. And it can be fast sometimes and slow at other times. And if your niece didn't know, she might think you were breathless, so we will explain that this is breathing that means you're deeply, deeply unconscious, so she won't be worrying about you. And at the very end of somebody's life, we have a period of slower breathing with long gaps, and then there will be one out-breath that just isn't followed by another in-breath. It's as gentle as that. No sudden rush of pain at the end, no feeling of fading away, no panic, no gasping. Do you think that that will be all right for your niece to see? Do you think that that will be a process that you can cope with? And as he was talking, her eyes were locked on his like tractor beams, and she was leaning closer and closer towards him, and she got hold of his hands and she kissed them. And she thanked him. And then she told us in her very French way that we were no longer required. And she sat back against those pillows and she relaxed. And I'd watched her shoulders becoming more relaxed as he was speaking. As my horror was increasing, hers was ebbing away. Because actually there is nothing more powerful than describing this truth, that the normal pattern of human dying is not terrifying awareness, it's gradual loss of that awareness. And as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross once said, not so much a presence of death as an absence of life. So this is the book of real events. Everybody's been changed in some way so that their identities are protected, and where I couldn't change them enough, I've had to trace the families, which means I've got some stories I couldn't tell because I couldn't find the families. So they're just normal dying stories. Obviously, most people were involved in a palliative care team because that's how I met most of them. But what I'm trying to do is help people to move from a view about dying being absolutely peacefully glorious or absolutely terrible, that kind of very black and white, all or nothing view, into noticing that it's actually something way more complex than that. So that we've got an answer for the unusual tragic cases that get huge amounts of press coverage, get huge amounts of public concern, because everybody reports the aeroplanes that fall out of the sky. Recently I was touring New Zealand talking about dying, you won't be surprised to hear. And I had to take something like 15 planes over the space of 12 days to get there, travel around there and get back. If all I knew about aeroplanes was what you read in the media, I would not have got on a single plane. And if all you knew about dying is what you read in the media, you will dread it. So rather than individual experience, what I'm trying to present is a broad view, where we're thinking about belonging to each other, where we've stopped talking about rights and autonomies and we've started to think about responsibilities and kindness. There is a paradox, isn't there, in trying to plan for future me, because actually I haven't met future me. I think she'll probably be quite a lot like me, but she might tolerate circumstances that I could not envisage myself tolerating. So we need to be able to help people to think about dying, to notice what happens to most people as they're dying, and be able to talk about accompanying people through that process without it needing to be medically complicated. Death is a social thing that might need a bit of medical help for some of the symptoms, but the process itself needs no help whatsoever. So I think that this is a public health issue. I think that it's fantastic that we've got 180 people sitting in a church in London on a Saturday to think about how we can re-establish public ownership of dying and how we can give dying back to everybody, to know more and to be less afraid. Thank you all so much for coming along to do this.